Hi, and welcome to today's short webinar on the 2026 FX definitions. I'm Ann Battle, and I'm joined by the rest of the team that worked on the FX definitions at ISDA, including John Martin, Michelangelo DiMarzio, and Lisa Kucharczyk. Today will be a very high-level introduction to the 2026 definitions, which will become the new standard framework for FX derivatives starting in November of 2027. To talk about how implementation will play out, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Michelangelo DiMarzio.
Thanks, Anne. The first thing I'd like to highlight, and I think it's quite important for market participants to take note of, is the fact that from November 22nd, 2027, SWIFT will stop supporting the 1998 FX definitions and will move over to reference the 2026 FX definitions on their messages. So that means that SWIFT users will need to make sure that they comply with the updated SWIFT standards if they wish to continue using SWIFT from the November 2027 release date going forward. The FX definition update project is a 4-year project that started in 2024 with a drafting phase that ended at the end of 2025 and culminated with the publication of the FX definitions on MyLibrary. That publication took place on March 3rd of this year after those 2 years of drafting. And at that point, the implementation phase officially started going through 2026 and into November 2027, giving the market over 18 months to prepare for the implementation date. So looking at what's new in the 2026 FX definitions. First of all, the 2026 FX definitions bring together documents that were published over the years since 1998, such as FX product supplements, for example, for barriers, for averaging, etc., as well as additional provisions documents, for example, optional early termination provisions, template terms for emerging market NDFs and NDOs that EMTA published separately from the 1998 FX definitions framework, and bring all of them into a single integrated framework. The advantage of that is also that the 2026 FX definitions, because of all of this integration, reduce the need for parties to enter and maintain bilateral master confirmation agreements, or MCAs. The 2026 FX definitions reduce complexity now, and it also makes future updates easier. This is because the modular components such as the main book, matrices, and exhibits can be updated separately as needed. So, for example, if only a matrix needs to be updated, that can be done separately from the main book so that the rest of the documentation framework remains as it is, which makes it easier for market participants to understand the change and to consume the changes. The definitions are published and maintained on ISDA's MyLibrary platform, which allows versioning of these updates to occur. So what that means is that if an update is needed to the 2026 FX definitions, the FX definitions will be updated and republished in their entirety on ISDA's MyLibrary platform without the need to be producing separate additional provisions or supplement to the original booklet. The latest version of the 2026 FX definitions as of the trade date will automatically apply to a transaction without the need for the parties to elect anything at a transaction level, therefore making usage and consumption of the updates a lot easier to market participants. The FX definitions are also designed to be aligned with financial product markup language, FPML, and ISDA's common domain model.
So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes going through these next 2 slides, which give an overview of the changes to the structure of the 2026 FX definitions compared to the old 1998 FX and currency option definitions. So obviously a huge amount has changed since 1998. As per ISDA's global FX derivatives market overview, FX derivatives reached a daily turnover of 6.6 trillion in 2025, and that's double what it was just over 10 years earlier, and actually 6 times what it was in 1998. So obviously an incredibly important market that has grown significantly since the FX definitions were first published. So how did the 1998 definitions keep up with this growth of the FX derivatives market? Well, back in 1998, the FX definitions were published as a paper book, so a hard copy paper book publication that wasn't able to be edited or updated over time. So as new products and things emerged, the ISDA and EMTA, we published supplements to those 1998 definitions and additional provisions which could be incorporated into people's confirmations alongside those 1998 definitions book. So, for example, there was a volatility variance swap correlation swap supplement published, a barrier option supplement published, a supplement for averaging transactions, additional provisions to deal with different disruption events for offshore deliverable CNY transactions. So just going on to the next slide, you can see that a large part of what we've done for the 2026 definitions, FX definitions, is to consolidate and bring all of these various publications together, under one umbrella document. So all of the different supplements that were published over the years, such as the correlation, the variance, the barrier option supplements, they just now appear as different sections in the 2026 FX definitions book. The EMTA template terms have been brought in under the umbrella of the FX definitions, and they are now represented in a matrix format. So each currency pair where there was a recommended EMTA template for it now is a different line in that matrix, and all the different variables and attributes are represented by the different columns. So a much more efficient way to set that up. And also we've also done that with some of the other sections of the book. So under the 1998 definitions, you had Annex A, which set out all the settlement rate options, generally set out as paragraphs of text, which described in a narrative form what that rate or benchmark was. That has now been set out in a matrix format, so a much more efficient structure. You can view all the different rates and compare all of them, the different columns representing the different attributes of those rates. So a much more efficient way to view those. So in summary, this is a much more efficient structure, everything under one roof. Also, it's future-proofed. When new provisions and new product classes come along in the future that need to be incorporated in, rather than having to publish a supplement or additional provisions, we can just reversion the book and add a new section in there. So everything in the future, foreseeable future, should remain under that one consolidated book structure.
The 2026 FX definitions also add an optional disruption event, which is specific settlement or conversion disruption. Counterparties can elect to apply that event so that a disruption event will apply under the transaction if an impossibility or something similar occurs that affects them and their transactions as opposed to the market generally. And that latter standard, the market generally, is what's required for the automatically applicable general settlement or conversion disruption. This slide also sets out on the right hand some of the fallbacks that apply for the disruption events. And disruption fallbacks are pre-agreed steps that counterparties will take when a disruption event has occurred. The waterfall, as you can see, depends on the disruption event that has actually occurred. ISDA will be coming out with much more detailed information on these events to help the market understand how they will apply prior to November of 2027. If we move on to the next slide. So now to go into some of the other substantive changes. Under the 2026 FX definitions, the calculation agent is expected to act in good faith using commercially reasonable procedures to produce a commercially reasonable result. This is the standard that is in the 2021 definitions used for rate transactions, but it is an evolution from the standard that applies today in the 1998 FX definitions. And importantly, it resolves a split between New York and UK law regarding the interpretation of the calculation agent's standard of care In addition, under the 2026 FX definitions, there are explicit provisions providing that the calculation agent will make all determinations that have not been allocated to another party, apart from determining whether a disruption event has occurred. Determining whether a disruption event has occurred will continue to be an objective determination. But by explicitly providing for the calculation agent to make other determinations, that means that the standard I described will apply to those determinations. The 2026 FX definitions also simplifies and streamlines the business day conventions, putting them all into a single framework with consistent naming and structure. This structure uses terms that are used in the 1998 FX definitions and in some cases related supplements. Those include currency business day, spot market business day, publication calendar day. And like the 98 definitions and the 2021 rates definitions, currency business day will continue to be determined by reference to the principal financial center of the relevant currency. So not a whole lot of substantive changes there, but hopefully a much easier to follow framework. And once again, we will be very shortly publishing detailed information explaining that framework. The next event on the right-hand side of this slide is calendar adjustment date provisions. And that is a new optional event that counterparties can elect to apply to address unexpected holidays that cause the settlement date for FX forward transactions to move. And if counterparties elect for these provisions to apply, they can choose to resolve the issue by either a price adjustment, where the calculation agent tweaks the economics of the existing trades to preserve the economics of the affected transactions, or a portfolio correction transaction, which is where the parties actually enter into a new transaction, but to similarly preserve the economics of the transactions once that new transaction is netted with the affected transactions. And I'll turn it back to Michelangelo for the last substantive change on this slide.
Thanks, Anne. Full automated exercise is an optional exercise mechanism for European-style deliverable FX options, where exercise or expiry is determined automatically by comparing the published settlement rate to the strike price, with no reliance on spot market observation and no reliance on manual exercise processes. It is important to note that the current exercise mechanism, i.e. automatic exercise, remains the default exercise method in the 2026 FX definitions. When full automated exercise applies, the option is exercise or it expires automatically on the expiration date, and any manual action by either party is ineffective, including notices to exercises or to not exercise. When the option is exercised or expires depends on which of the two currencies the strike price and the settlement rate are quoted. For example, is it the call currency per 1 unit of the put currency, or is it the put currency per 1 unit of the call currency? And the relative levels at expiration date will be determining whether the expiration or the expiry takes place. And all of this with clear default outcomes if the settlement rate equals the strike price on the expiration date, with the ability by the parties to elect a different outcome at the transaction level if they wish to do so.
Thanks, Michelangelo. So as I mentioned in the previous slides, a big part of the new definitions is consolidating all of the EMTA published recommended template terms into the 2026 definitions. So previously, when people wanted to confirm a non-deliverable forward or non-deliverable option, they would either replicate those recommended template terms as a standalone confirmation and incorporate the 1998 definitions into that, or they would enter into a master confirmation agreement with their counterparty that incorporated all of those EMTA recommended template terms and which really acted as a bridge between the ISDA definitions and the recommended template terms and the actual trade confirmation. Now, under the 2026 definitions, because all of those EMTA recommended template terms have now been integrated into the 2026 definitions and, as I mentioned before, transposed into a matrix format, there is no need to actually maintain a master confirmation agreement to actually provide that linkage between the EMTA terms and the ISDA definitions. So all you have to do if you want to confirm a non-deliverable forward or a non-deliverable option under those recommended terms is to actually reference that in your trade confirmation, and the EM matrix will then be applicable, and that will apply those terms. So a much more operationally efficient way to incorporate those terms. So really, doing away for the need to maintain master confirmation agreements for that purpose.
Thanks, John. So let's talk about implementation a little bit more in detail. It is important to reiterate that the industry transition date of November 22nd, 2027 is mandatory from a SWIFT implementation and industry-wide for that reason. From that point on, new transactions using SWIFT can no longer reference the 1990 definitions, and SWIFT users, if they wish to continue using SWIFT, they will need to ensure that they are submitting SWIFT messages in line with the new standards that will be aligned with the 2026 FX definitions. What that also means is that confirmations, messaging, and downstream systems will all need to align with the 2026 FX definitions framework. And the idea is that both the paper and electronic confirmation workflows will align around the same go-live date to achieve consistency across the market and consistencies across transaction types.
ISDA posts a range of information on the FX definitions update info hub, which we will link to in the video description. Right now, you can find educational materials such as a short brochure used to socialize and update and provide a high-level overview of changes, and the industry implementation roadmap, which provides a framework to support implementation up to November 2027. The info hub is updated from time to time with new information. Some planned support materials we expect to post ahead of implementation are a plain English guide, red lines, and mapping tables showing changes from the 1998 FX definitions at different levels of detail, annotated color-coded confirmation templates, and sample trade confirmations. We'll also be hosting more educational conferences and webinars.
Thanks, Lisa. So this slide just gives an excerpt from that implementation roadmap. And from experience of previous implementation work on definition booklets, such as the 2021 definitions, it's clear that implementing a new set of definitions is a significant amount of work for firms to do. So we conducted interviews with a cross-section of key firms in the industry to really get an idea of how they are approaching their implementation work across operations, technology, legal, client-facing teams, etc. And we produced this implementation roadmap that really summarizes all of those interviews and really gives some recommendations of what firms could do to start their own projects. So this is really aimed at firms that may not have actually started their implementation work, and we hope that this implementation roadmap can give firms a little head start in their planning. And this slide is an excerpt from that, showing some recommended timelines for the different aspects of that implementation work.